Well, hello everybody. David Stone from ABDI, or the Agribusiness Development Institute here. Welcome to today's session on creating a roadmap to move your agribusiness forward. I'm joined by Gordon Stone, who is the Director of ABDI and also Principal Program Facilitator and Mentor. So Gordon, how you going?
Yeah, well, Dave, thanks very much.
Good. So just before we get into it, we'll just start with a little bit of housekeeping. As everyone knows, people are generally on poor internet connections, so we don't try and do anything too fancy with this. We'll just keep it fairly low-key moving through the slides. At the end of the session, there'll be a short survey. We obviously try and make these as beneficial and as useful for participants as possible, so please take the time just to answer a couple of short questions. And we also want to make these as interactive as possible for people. So you'll see in your little dashboard, or however it appears on your screen if you're joining us on a computer, that there's actually a little question bar and a chat bar. So if at any point during the session you have a couple of questions, we'll be dealing with them at the end. And feel free to just type them into that question bar there. And as I said, we'll get to them at the end. Okay, so the topic for today is creating the roadmap to move your agribusiness forward. So this is quite an interesting topic, and it comes up quite a lot in the conversations in our chat groups and our various online forums that we have with our program participants, because a lot of people find themselves in a position where they might have been working hard on building a business and working hard on creating something that they've put a lot of blood, sweat and tears into, but they get to a point where often they're just a bit stuck and they're looking for a way to actually, take things to the next level, or they're looking for a way to just maintain the momentum or keep things moving. So that's really what today is all about. It's about how do we create that roadmap to actually move forward to, get where we want to go with things. So we'll move on to the next part. So we just need to say that this webinar is presented in association with those various partners you can see at the bottom there. There's an MLA donor company, there's AgForce in Queensland and the Queensland Government. So this is in association with the Agri-Business Management Program. And fundamentally, that's about people taking time out to work on their business. It's about working on the business side of things rather than the production side of things. And fundamentally, it's also about getting an education. So those partners actually see that something like that is of great benefit to people in the agricultural industry throughout Australia. So that's why they've come on board to support this particular program. So just a quick introduction to some of those aspects of the program. The first part is really around the business coaching for the bush. So that is basically it's a really low cost, low time intensity activity where you can actually get access to a business advisor when you need it and for the purposes that you need in your business. So that's generally, you get a fresh perspective on how to actually take the business forward, and you'll meet up with those people to help maintain the momentum as you're looking to go through a change process in the business. The next step up from that is a 3-month Agribusiness by Design program. So that's really a fast-track business program, which have been running throughout Queensland and New South Wales this year. So that is an introduction around the fundamentals and the foundations of creating a best practice business. So it's a 2-day workshop followed by 12 weeks of online learning and mentoring. So is a great way to kickstart a change process if you're looking to do that. And finally, the Elevate program, which is generally ABDI's flagship program, and it's a 12-month agribusiness management program. And it's around the 12 pillars of business best practice, which we'll describe in a moment, which is really a very holistic way of looking at all the various parts of your business and how you can actually create a bit of create change around those various areas. And it encompasses things like getting clear on where the business is going, how to manage people in the business, how to manage your finances, creating systems, understanding what product you should take to market that would be most profitable. And it's also, there'll be meetups with people meetups with people that are in a similar position to you, like-minded people, and presentations from business mentors. So that's just a quick introduction to what those programs are. So I guess we'll get into it, and this is really around creating the context for what we're talking about today. So in everything that ABDI looks to do, or everything that people that are involved in the programs that we run, generally speaking, what we're looking to achieve is this notion of a high-performing business. So as I said before, there is these 12 pillars of business best practice, which fundamentally create the framework for you to think about how you can actually take that business to that next level of becoming a high-performing business. So as we'll go through this today, we'll talk about, well, it's important to break things down into bite-sized chunks. So those 12 pillars have been condensed into basically those 4 points you can see in front of you, which is product, positioning, processes, and people. So the reason that we've broken those down is that it's a really useful way for people to think about all of these different topics. So, for example, we're talking about how to create the roadmap to move the business forward. So each of those different categories can be thought about in relation to that particular topic. So if we're thinking about product, what is the highest value product you can create to present to the most discerning customer that's willing to pay for that product? And really, when you're thinking about the roadmap, it's, you have to focus on that particular offering and that have a very single-minded focus on creating that product and actually really engaging with the customer around how you can generate that product, which will also lead to the greatest returns at the end of the day. So positioning is the next concept there, which is highlighted because positioning is really important, because not only is it thinking about, well, how are we positioned in the marketplace right now? How do other people perceive our businesses? Because that's very important when you think about creating the roadmap. But also it's about where do you see your business in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, which is all about creating the vision for where you'd like to take your business to. So fundamental in creating the roadmap is actually that notion of where the business is actually going, which we refer to as the end game. So talking about processes, which are the processes that will actually support you in carrying out this roadmap? So it might be around, communication. It might be around financial management. It might be around different business systems, which will actually facilitate this outcome. And finally, around people. People is obviously one of the most important parts of running a business, because particularly when we're creating on a change process, on a journey, often we have to get other people to come on that journey with us. So it's really important to understand how we can engage with other people in the business, as well as people external of the business when we're looking to create a change process. So if we're thinking of the context for today's discussion, the part at the top of the slide there is a mantra that ABDI abides by, and it is something we look to get all the people involved in the programs that we run to be really focused and adopted that as their mantra. So the notion there is around creating a high-performing, self-managing, profitable, and saleable or investor-ready agribusiness. So that means very different things to different people, and I might get Gordon to actually just elaborate on that a little bit and also help us to set up the context for the discussion today.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. You're right. A mantra like this is actually part of the concept of the roadmap. You mentioned before, like a 5-year plan, 10-year plan, 15-year plan, and so on. That's big picture. Sometimes we're focused on the next 6 months, 12 months, or whatever it may be. But having this idea that sits behind it of exactly what we're intending to do around a high-performing, self-managing, profitable and saleable or investor-ready agribusiness provides some discipline. And so the reason, and previously and on other occasions, we can talk about the specifics of what that end game would look like. But to actually get that mantra from a concept into some details is what this roadmap discussion is about. And so the idea of being on the right track, maintaining that discipline and focus, and thinking about the change process, which is often very confronting, and that's what today's discussion is about, is quite critical. And self-managing ourselves as business owners and those people around us is equally quite critical. And we talk quite glibly about the concept of change. But as human beings, like, the thing that we often find is that we bump up against our glass ceiling. And so the reason for the discussion today in this session is, if we think about making minor adjustments, or we think about breaking things down into step-by-step processes of change, it's kind of mentally and also emotionally and probably subconsciously an easier way of just going, look, I'll just do a bit, then I'll do another bit, and then I'll do another bit. And the thing is, we talk about celebrating success because you suddenly discover that when you're able to break things down into bite-sized chunks, you discover to your surprise that you've got where you wanted to go. Or when you're dealing with some of those confronting things, again, you break it down to those bite-sized bits, and then you discover that you've made a significant amount of progress. So Dave, that's what the context is about.
Thanks, Gordon. And probably one other thing I'll just add is what we're talking about here is not necessarily something like something very tangible like writing a business plan. Some people might think that that is the roadmap. We're actually talking about a step before that, which it's probably at a much deeper level, which is, as you said, what's going to stop you getting from where you are now to where you want to be in the future, which is really that change process that we've been talking about. So it's things like, feeling overwhelmed and getting stuck, losing motivation because you're not making progress, not feeling like you have the knowledge to make the decision. So that's probably the context for what we're talking about today. So if we think about the key takeaways, we've actually got an acronym here, which is SPACE. So Gordon, it would be good if you can just run us through this quickly.
Well, Dave, because this is such an important topic, I wanted to think of, I guess, a simple way of us considering it. And human beings, who they are, a concept like a term like space is actually an easy way of us thinking about it. So my mindset went like this. We're on a journey. There is some confront in the process. So what goes on? Well, sometimes it's important when it all gets too much. We just need to do a stock take or a reset. That's what the S is all about. And then sometimes we go, I'm not sure where I'm heading to, so I need to actually engage with some people who can actually help me think much more expansively. And that's where the whole concept of professional development or getting an education comes in. And then when we think about support, we need to think about who's aligned and on the same journey or aligned in our thinking with where we're heading to. Because sometimes we need to call on those people for support. That's where the A comes in. And then, like we've already said, breaking things down into bite-sized chunks so the overwhelm doesn't get too great is really quite critical. And then sometimes when we've kind of hit our glass ceiling or whatever it may be, or it all gets too much, we just say, okay, I just need to get started. So what do I do first? And that's where the E comes in. And I'll talk a little bit further down the track about the 6 out of 10 and action cures fear. But Dave, that's where the space came from. It's about the journey. It's about thinking about how we manage ourselves and manage the journey.
Yeah, which is, as you said, it's very important that we as business owners actually can take the time to acknowledge, what it is that's holding us back and how we can actually manage that process. So some guiding principles around this process. We'll go through this fairly quickly because this is covered in a lot of other content that we've worked through. But Gord, are there any particular ones in there that you'd like to pull out as being more important?
Well, look, I think they're all very important. But one of the things that happens with us with a journey is we need to take time out. We need to actually devote the time to work on the business. And one of the things that we do discover is we don't know what we don't know. And they're quite critical elements of this whole process because that's where the whole getting in the education comes into it. But one of the things that we won't be touching on in this session today, but I think is really critical for us to be thinking about is what makes us special. And in our programs, we always cover this. And I find it's almost one of the most confronting things for people to think about, which is what makes me special. And so the assumption is that you are spending a bit of time thinking about that, or if you're not, or you're finding it's a bit confronting, just kind of park it in your mind and go, well, for me to create this high-performing, self-managing, scalable, profitable, investor-ready agribusiness, I will have to stand out from the crowd. And so that can be a little bit confronting, but maybe if I'm going to justify the blood, sweat, tears, and effort that I'm putting into, then this kind of specialness is something that I'll have to think about. And that's where that aligned group of people often come in. And then finally, the bit about writing things down. I'm sure you've heard about this before, but it really does work that if you write things down, they become real. And also you have to work out how specifically you're going to go down the pathway. And the roadmap is all about walking down the path, going on the journey.
Yeah, and I'd have to agree with that last one. It's so important. When you've actually written something down, it gives you something to talk to other people in the business about, rather than it just being an idea that's, in the ether. People can actually tangibly see, what you're trying to get at, and can actually get on board with the business plans. So that's something that's very important. Okay, so let's get into this. As we talk about time for a stock take or reset. So I think we all know as business owners that we're incredibly busy. We are always finding ourselves getting bogged down in the daily to-do list and trying to actually get our head above water and actually work out, well, what are the important things? Taking time out to think, okay, long term, where do we want to take the business? Actually, as I said, getting your head above water, it's almost like can't see the forest for the trees. We often lose sight of where we really want to take things and generally why we also got into things in the first place. And it talks about getting, we get worn out, we get quite emotional about the whole process because we don't feel like we're making progress, and we lose momentum. So there's some of the key issues when it comes to thinking about why should you take a stock take. So Gordon, when we're talking about actually taking a stock take, a lot of people actually ask us, when you say this word stock take, what do you actually mean? And how can we actually go about doing that? So do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I do, Dave. And look, this slide was created deliberately because of that question that is often asked in programs and in one-on-one discussions that we have with people, or even in the work that we do one-on-one with clients. And I guess it's built on my own experience as well, when I've found that I have to do a stock take or a reset. And remember, what this is about is actually working on the business. So what we've got to do is give ourselves a break. And so that's literally and it's emotionally, give ourselves a break. And so what I would do, pardon me, is historically, I would just go and rent a unit and spend a bit of time away working on the business. Sometimes we talk to people in agriculture, for example, who say, look, there's just too much going on. So I say to them, look, sometimes you've actually just got to move away from where all the fuss and bother is. It might be as simple as going into town and having a coffee but spending half a day doing it, which is just give yourself a break. Maybe take your significant other with you and think about some critical things. Have a bit of an agenda, or maybe even not. Just have a discussion about stuff, we'll call it. So the holiday is the ideal. Moving yourself away from where all the fuss and bother happens is quite important. But equally, this notion of professional development. Like here we are today on a webinar. We're actually a group of people who are actually contributing to our own professional development. And so what I hope everyone will find is that they will go, we've actually spent some time in this session today, and we've actually been re-energized. We've got a little bit of an education. We've now thought a little bit differently about what we're doing. So that actually helps us think about how we actually do things differently. And just taking a bit of time out is often valuable simply because it helps us do this reset. and then we can actually think about that next step.
Yeah, good. And I think an important thing you did touch on, it's important to take the significant other. That's in a case of, I guess, a family-run business, but generally it's important to have other key decision makers part of any of these, I guess, stock take processes, because we all know what it's like when we have a bit of a revelation and then we go back to the business and we find that other people aren't on board with what we've talked about, and it just falls on deaf ears. So we want to avoid those sorts of things happening and make sure that other people are part of this stock take process.
And Dave, before you leave that topic, the assumption in what we just mentioned was that we've got a group of people on the journey together. From time to time, there are individual people who are just saying, and I've been this myself, look, I've got to do something different. And the beauty of professional development, if you can get into a group of like-minded people, you get re-energized, you do some networking, you think differently, you get exposed to how others tackle things, and you go, yep, I could do that. So that's actually really where the benefit of professional development comes in. And we see it time and time again in the programs that we run as well. So back to you, Dave.
Thanks, good. And I mean, that's a good entree into this next part, because it is around professional development. And it's not just around, a lot of people focus on professional development, which is basically improving, getting access to new ideas and improving the way that you might do things. A lot of people are very comfortable doing that when it comes to production side of things, but fundamentally it's important to get education on all aspects of managing the business, which also includes, areas around business management, people management, and also working on yourself personally. So we talk here about on a journey of change. Sometimes we actually get stuck because we might just have a scenario where we just do not know the best way to solve a problem. And it would be brilliant if we could just bounce these ideas off a few people. But often, particularly in agriculture, we find that we feel a bit alone in this process, and we don't have that support network to really just bounce ideas off at any point in time. Also, it talks about there about business owners wear a lot of hats. So what we mean by that is, as a business owner, you have to not only know all of the production side of things or the technical side of things, you have to be the person that can manage people incredibly well and manage staff. You also need to be able to manage the books, and not just manage the books, but also be thinking about financial strategy and wealth creation and all of those sorts of things. You need to be on top of systems in the business and all sorts of things like that. And it can become quite overwhelming. And as we said there as well, you don't know what you don't know. We are very comfortable when it comes to dealing with the knowns, but when it comes to the unknowns, that's when it starts to raise a bit of that confront. And we actually need to be able to take a step back and get access to other people. So, Gordon, if you wanted to just run us through the notion there around the value of professional development, I think you've probably touched on it already, but maybe just give a brief overview of it.
Well, Dave, I particularly like that quote down the bottom, which is working smarter, not harder. And we hear that and we go, well, I suppose some of us would go, and I've done this myself, is what does that really mean? And so what we're trying to do is to use every hour of the day efficiently and effectively. And that might even mean taking time out. So while on the one hand, we're thinking about professional development, we're thinking about expanding our knowledge, we're thinking about engaging with other people, sometimes we've actually just got to do a timeout thing. At the same time though, one of the other points that's on this slide here is about becoming the outsider looking into your business. And that's where professional development is really, really valuable, because sometimes we've got to look at our everyday business with new eyes. While that's handy to do with other people, at the same time, if we're the business owner or the one who's driving the business forward, it's really our responsibility, our obligation, and probably our joy and pleasure. So that's where the outsider looking in comes in. And seriously, I know I've found it from my own experience, and again, people in our program, this idea of engaging with others to help us get re-energized, back on track, refocused, is so, so valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the most important things there is that fresh perspective, because when you actually, as we said before as well, you don't know what you don't know, but when you get access to other people, seeing how other people do things, it actually can give you this entirely new way of looking at things. And in many cases, I mean, we've got a perfect example in one of the programs where someone from the dairy industry has gone overseas and they've looked at ways that people in the US and I think Canada were doing things, and has come back and he's just said, well, my return on investment from that trip is like a 20 to 1. It just means that I have recognized that um, the things that I can change as a result of watching how other people do things in my own operation back home has just been absolutely invaluable. So that's really the benefit of something like professional development. It's access to different people and different ways of thinking. So if we moved on, this is the third part around aligned allies, which is our support network. And we've most certainly touched on this, which is particularly around the benefit of getting access to other people with different ways of thinking. But there's a lot to be said for just knowing that other people are going through the same thing that you're going through, which is one of them. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that, you know what, there's actually a lot of people pushing through and um, pushing hard to actually do the same sorts of things that you're doing. So maybe, Gordon, if you wanted to just talk us through this particular one as well.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. We've put this photo of an aspen grove in there, and I know that's a US or Canadian or whatever option. And as I was putting this in there, I was thinking to myself, well, for those of us who live in brigalow country or whatever, it's almost like, brigalow suckers or wattle suckers or whatever else it may be. But that has its own connotation. So let's think of it from the point of view of an aspen grove. What happens with an aspen grove? One tree will grow, then like-minded trees will grow around it, often from common rootstock, but not necessarily. And what happens is there's strength in numbers. And as they grow and develop more successfully because they've got like-minded individuals around them. So when we think of our aligned allies or the support network, basically what we're after is people who are on the same page as us. Because when the going gets tough, we just need that sounding board. We just need those other people who can just go, look, remember why you're doing this. Remember how, or the things that we've done before. Remember that it might be just time to go take a breath and then get going again. And the thing about that is sometimes you can explain things to other people who don't understand these strange idiosyncrasies or oddities that go on. But this group of insiders who've been on the journey with you, or maybe who are just at a slight distance, it might be your advisors, they're the ones who can go, just remember what this is all about. Think of the vision. Think of the fire in the belly that you had. Think of the focus that you've had and get going again. And you might be able to say to that group, well, look, I'm stuck here. What do I need to do? And they're often the people who can go, remember what? Or why don't you do this? Or why don't you do that? That's why that support network is so critical.
And I think I'd probably just add one thing, which is that, this probably does talk more towards having an external group of people that you can lean on. But one of the things that you can also do is look for your allies within your business. So we often hear discussions, particularly around intergenerational businesses, where people have a bit of trouble, engaging with other people from other generations and actually, having that discussion around the change that needs to happen. But more often than not, you'll find there's allies within the business who share your vision, who share your desire to make the change. It's just that you have to go and find those people. And actually, once you actively understand that there are people in the business that you can lean on, then it makes things a lot easier.
So, Dave, one thing I'd like to add there, because we've got a group in one of our programs who are feeling a little bit alone. But what they've discovered out there in sister-in-law land, because this is a bloke we're talking about, there's a sister-in-law who is very, aligned in thinking and feeling and seeing what this person is trying to do. And so when the chips are down and frustration sets in, that's where the sounding board lies. So it might be slightly at a distance, but something like that sort of person can be extremely valuable.
Thanks, Gordon. And I'd just like to remind everyone, if you do have any questions, please just type them into that question box and we'll deal with them at the end when they come up. So the next part is around the C, which is this bite-sized chunks. So really that's around breaking this process down into bite-sized chunks to actually create the roadmap to move the business forward. So what often happens is that people see this almost insurmountable task ahead of them, which is, I know where I want to take the business, but there are so many moving parts. There are so many things that I've got to do, not just now, but I know that there's in 3 months' time I've got to, do something else, and then in a year I'll have to do something else, and it just seems to build up and become this just absolute mountain of a task. So often what happens is people get overwhelmed and they lose motivation because they don't feel like they're making progress. Often because, as I said before, you're wearing so many hats, people have their, feet in so many different parts of the business. And what ends up happening is that people try to do too much and they end up doing nothing well. And they really end up spinning the wheels. So, and we've also said they're very unsure on the where to from here, because when you've got this massive task ahead of you, and you really don't want to, go down the path of, as we said, you don't want to go down another dry gully because you know what that's like. So sometimes people are a bit hesitant to actually, act on things because they're unsure of where to go. So that's really what we're talking here about, around breaking down things into bite-sized chunks. So the notion here is, and what we've got on the screen there is a picture of an elephant. This actually helps people in our programs think about this a bit better, because the question is, how do you eat an elephant? And this might sound stupid, but the answer to that is you eat an elephant one bite at a time. And that's exactly the way you should be thinking about, how do I grow my business? How do I take things to the next level? It is one step at a time. So Gordon, did you want to elaborate on that a little bit for us, please?
Yeah, I do, Dave. And it's interesting that we've used the elephant one bite at a time analogy. And you also mentioned the idea of climbing a mountain. Like, an elephant is a big thing, a mountain's a big thing. And for any of us who've ever gone out there and climbed a mountain, just kind of think about this journey, the roadmap, a bit like climbing a mountain as well, which is we get up to a certain point, we can look down and go, it's great to be up here. Then look up at the next point and go, how do I go about getting there? Right, now I'll get there. Then you look down and say, I'm actually 2 steps or 2 big chunks of distance on the way up this mountain. And that's a really important part of thinking about breaking the journey of building a business down into bite-sized chunks. So what we're after then is we're looking for the capacity to maintain that momentum. We're looking for the ability to break things down into bits, particularly when overwhelm kicks in. And what we're really looking for, which is quite critical, is this idea of celebrating success. And as human beings, and particularly Australians, we're always disencouraged, I'll say, to celebrate success. And yet that's what we've got to do to keep that emotional connection. And even better, if we can actually monitor and measure the level of success that we've achieved. And if you think of the aligned allies that we mentioned before, we can therefore have a conversation with them and say, look at the progress we've made. And then you get a buzz out of that and you go, well, look, I'm ready to get my next bite of the elephant. And so these are the reasons why bite-sized chunks are so critical. And sometimes, this is not even in this system, but I find this myself and I find it with other people we work with, is when you're busy working on the business, sometimes you've just got to go back to those things that you are familiar with and that you find easy to do. It just gives you the opportunity to take a breather and then go again.
Yeah, and I'd really like to highlight that notion of that when we say easy wins, often they're not easy, but it's really important to actually experience some successes. And it might be really small things, but often when we're trying to build a business or create change, we often feel that we are coming up against roadblocks, and it can be easy to get into a negative headspace. But the important thing is to actually understand that you're always making progress. We're always moving forward, and even if it's little things, it's important to celebrate them. So the notion around breaking things down into bite-sized chunks means that there actually can be incremental progress that you can see and that you can recognise, and that contributes to motivation and maintaining the momentum so much. It's so important.
So Dave, before you leave that too, I think a really important point to make is earlier we talked about the idea of heading off into town to a cafe or taking a couple of days off and having a night down the coast or whatever place is somewhere where you feel safe, where you feel enjoyment. And then if you have the capacity to take a significant other, whatever that means, then you can actually talk about maybe the things that are going wrong, but I would far prefer that people talked about the things that are going right and look back and then look forward and said, okay, these are the things that have gone well. There are a few things that haven't gone so well, but let's go again.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all know what it's like to be caught in a bit of a downward spiral of negativity. So it's important to be able to take that time out and step away from things. So if we move on to the fifth area here, which is the E, which is taking that easy first step. So we've definitely talked about the idea of people getting stuck and not being sure where to go next. So there's a couple of areas here which I actually might get Gordon to elaborate on, and there's a couple that are really important, which is the law of fear and then paralysis by analysis. So Gordon, did you want to elaborate on those a little bit?
Yeah, I do, Dave, because they are really quite important. So let's deal with paralysis by analysis first, which is, well, it's actually to do with the law of fear. So when the law of fear kicks in, it means we as individuals actually see all the things that can go wrong, and particularly if we're a bit gung-ho, which I have had a tendency to be as well, when things do go a bit wrong, the law of fear really kicks in. And so we start to fear the change that we know must be made. Then what happens is procrastination or paralysis by analysis. And what that can mean is we become particularly introspective. And at that time, it's just like, I don't know what I can do, so I won't do anything. So what we're looking to do here is to break that cycle, break the cycle around the law of fear, break the cycle around procrastination and constant analysis, and break the cycle of negativity. So how do we do that? We think about it from a point of view of our first simple, easy step. That's what this is all about, Dave.
And one more thing, just before we move on, but around the paralysis by analysis, is that a lot of people, particularly business owners, they are what you would call high performers. They might be perfectionists, and often when you're not sure whether something you're about to undertake can be done to 100% of your ability, often people think to themselves, well, if I can't do it perfectly, then I probably shouldn't do it. And you keep holding off until you think I'm ready. But at the end of the day, right now is as good a time as any to get going on these sorts of things. And as we'll talk about in the next slide, there's an absolutely brilliant saying, which is action cures fear. So maybe let's move there. Gordon, did you want to elaborate on that a bit, please?
Yeah, look, I'd love to, Dave. I think you've set the scene well around the idea of action cures fear. And that's where the idea of maybe not being too gung-ho, but taking counsel from those aligned allies, or doing the stock take and saying, what's an easy first step? Okay, now I can actually embark on that first step. The other point that's there is my 6 out of 10 scenario. And I find when we run people through this concept in our programs, they go, oh, thank God, I don't have to be right every time. So what this 6 out of 10 concept is all about is it's come from research that I've done with some people who know about how successful business operators work. And they just accept that 4 out of 10, or maybe even 5 out of 10 things will go wrong. But 6 out of 10 is pretty much a good and known average of success in decision making. So if we're going to make decisions, we have to accept that things will go wrong. And there'll be the perfectionists out there who say, I cannot afford for anything to go wrong. And yet, what's life? Life is that stuff happens. So what we're aiming to do is to be as orderly and organized as we can. When that fear kicks in, we just say, okay, what's that simple first step? And that's where we've made the notion about nothing ventured, nothing gained. But when the fear's kicked in, we need to make sure that first simple step is one that is going to lead to some success. So it gives us the momentum to keep on keeping on.
Yeah, and this is brilliant because I'm sure everyone's aware that you learn far more from things that don't work out than the things that do work out. So we need to keep that in mind, particularly around that 6 out of 10 things strike rate, because if you think of someone that goes out there and, it's almost not being afraid to fail or fail fast, however you wanted to describe it. Someone that goes out there with that kind of attitude ends up doing a heck of a lot more things than the person that sits there and goes, no, I want this to be 100% before I go anywhere with it. So, and if you think about, from things that might go wrong, we learn a lot more. It's important to keep that approach in mind as we're looking to take that first step, because at the end of the day, action cures fear, and just taking that first step is one of the most important parts. So, summary. It's been quite what I would consider to be quite a deep session. We're talking about a lot of those things that are, happening at an internal level with us as business owners. A lot of those internal things that we grapple with. So, Gordon, please, could you just take us through a bit of a summary of these things that we need to consider when we're going through this journey of change?
Sure. Well, Dave, the most important thing for us to understand is that it is indeed a journey. And indeed, there will be some change. And indeed, change brings with it confront. The idea around the simple first step is quite critical. And the reason the acronym of SPACE is so important is when we're on the journey of change, from time to time as human beings, we just need to have a bit of space, a bit of time out. We need to have a bit of space to engage with those aligned allies. And so sometimes this reset has to be done at a conscious level. So I guess I want to put forward the proposition to everyone listening that sometimes it is important to consciously go, I need to do a little reset. And if that's the case, then I need to think about maybe, do I need some education on some things that I feel is not working, or no, is not quite working according to plan? Can I use these people who are gathered around me? Because often we'll be surprised agreeably how many people are gathered around us when we actually stop and think positively about it, who are aligned in our journey and are rooting for us. And when things go pear-shaped, the question is, I've got to get back on the horse. What do I do with that first simple step? So now that I've got back on the horse, let's make it a winner. And the beauty of the monitoring and measuring progress is that when we look back, we actually see that we've achieved a lot. And then we can get going again, knowing that 6 out of 10 things are going to work. And if we hit one of those 4 that doesn't work, it might be, well, look, as long as it's not too much of a crisis, we just keep on keeping on. So that's what this summary to me is all about, Dave.
Thanks, Gordon. And probably a really important point is that this is, as you said, it's a journey, but it's an imperfect process. There will be ups and downs, there will be bumps, roadblocks, and all those sorts of things. And as they say, it's more about how you deal with what happens to you than what actually happens to you. So going through a process like this and giving yourself some space is actually a really good way to actually do a reset and get up and get going again. So the next part is we wanted to do a bit of a Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to type them in the question bar. There's actually a couple that have come through. So while I might just ask Gordon some of those questions, if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to type them in the question bar and send them through, and we'll endeavour to answer them. And if we don't get around to answering them this time, we might we will be able to respond to you via email afterwards. And there's some contact details at the end. So please feel free to have a look at that question bar and actually start typing some questions in. So there's a couple of questions. First question here says, how do I get other people to get on board with this process? At the moment, I feel like I'm the only one pushing for change in the business. So Gordon, do you have any thoughts around that?
Sure. Dave, I think it's important for people to think about getting this kind of aligned group around them. That's the first thing. The second thing, if we feel alone, if we've developed some kind of written plan, it's important to go back to that plan and go, what was I trying to achieve? How am I going about doing it? And what's the next step? And that's where the beauty of the aligned allies comes in. That's where the idea of looking backwards and then looking forwards and then breaking things down into bite-sized chunks come in. So it is easy to feel alone, and that's where the idea of the Aspen Grove comes in. Can I find some others around who will help me on this journey?
And I mean, one other part I might ask around that is, how do you get other people maybe in the business on board? Is there any strategies that you can suggest to actually, maybe around communication or around some sort of governance structures or something like that, which you might be able to use?
Sure, Dave. Look, that's a very good point, and we haven't even raised the idea of advisory boards. We haven't even raised the idea of management meetings and things along those lines. But the beauty of in the business, if we have those family members or staff members or whoever else it may be, or external advisors, one way to keep the momentum up is from a working in the business perspective, those weekly meetings, and that might support you with working on the business. But the value of having, say, a monthly advisory board meeting is that it keeps us focused on what is the grand plan? How are we progressing with the grand plan? And so I can't stress enough the idea of formal meetings and a bit of formality around plans, because it actually makes you work on the business as well. It's another one of those working on the business must-dos.
Thanks, Gordon. Okay, next question. So we've got someone here who's used one of our analogies actually, so I'm getting overwhelmed because of all the hats I have to wear. Do you have any tips to help through this?
Sure. So if we're wearing lots of hats, you might remember a comment that I made earlier in this session, and that was, and you observed too, Dave, that we might have to be a financial manager. We might have to be a marketer. We might have to be a personnel manager. We might have to be creating systems and things along those lines. Sometimes we've got to think, where do our strengths lie? Where do our weaknesses lie? If that's the case, and we are wearing too many hats, maybe the question is there somebody else there that I can get to give me a hand? I mean, we could say in an orderly fashion, how can you delegate? That may be possible, it may be less possible, particularly if you're a very, very strong, small team. But sometimes that's where the advisors come in. If you can have somebody who either is paid or not paid to give you some advice, that can be very handy. The other side of it is when we think about that communication, that's again where we can actually communicate with others, and they may help give us some of those tips as well to help things kick along a little bit further in a more orderly fashion.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Gordon. So I'm just looking at the time as well. I think we're getting towards the end, so we probably should wrap things up. But if anyone has any questions, on this next slide, you'll see some contact details there. So if you do have any questions around this, please feel free to get in touch. And if you do feel it's something that you could benefit from, which is actually taking some time out, doing a bit of a stock take, getting other people in the business to start to I guess, become more aligned and everyone to sort of get on the same page. If you think that getting an education and thinking a bit differently, getting a fresh perspective on, some of the problems that you might be facing in your business, then feel free to actually have a look at some of those programs which are being run in association with this webinar. So you can do that by heading to the website, which is www.abdi.com.au, and then you can follow that link there, which is to programs. Or, as I said, please just get in touch with us at either that email address there, or happy to have a chat if you prefer to call via phone. So, Gordon, is there anything you wanted to say in way of closing?
Dave, I think the most important thing is for people to have self-confidence and faith in what they're doing. Sometimes self-confidence and faith can be a bit shaken. That's why we've developed the SPACE acronym. So it provides an opportunity for us to go back and think about some of those things in an orderly fashion to allow us to regroup, reassess, get going again. And I think it's really important then to think also about who out there can actually help lighten the load. So they're really the key things, Dave. If you're on a journey to change, a journey of change, break it down into bite-sized chunks, find some key people, get some support. Don't be too hard on yourself. That's the other critical thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as I alluded to before, it's important to recognise the importance of the internal things that go on within us, because often, we might feel like we're not making progress when it comes to things in the business, but often it can be because there's, things happening within us that we need to deal with before we can actually start to move forward, particularly roadblocks around fear, roadblocks around, perfectionism, roadblocks around that notion of paralysis by analysis, and just taking that first step. So from my point of view, it's been great. Been great to talk to you, Gordon, and I hope everyone has really enjoyed the session today. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. Otherwise, stay tuned for the next webinar. Bye for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Bye for all.